56 years of Earth Day proves accountability and action can coexist. On April 22, 1970, an estimated 20 million Americans showed up. They gathered on college campuses, in city parks, along roadsides, and in town squares, not to celebrate anything, but to demand something. Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin had proposed a national teach-in on the environment, inspired by a 1969 oil spill off Santa Barbara that had blackened 35 miles of California coastline. He expected a response. What he got was a movement. Within a year of that first Earth Day, public opinion polls showed a dramatic shift, with 63% of Americans considering it very important to work on environmental protection, rising from a very low base just a few years earlier. The EPA was created, the Clean Air Act was overhauled, and the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and Toxic Substances Control Act all followed within the decade. Earth Day didn't produce those outcomes by being optimistic. It produced them by making the cost of inaction impossible to ignore. 56 years later, that same dynamic is still running. And for business leaders, understanding it has become a genuine strategic requirement. What Nelson actually understood. Nelson's insight wasn't that people cared about the environment. It was that the political and institutional systems of his time had no mechanism to register how much they cared. Earth Day was designed to create that mechanism. It worked not because it was a celebration, but because it translated diffuse public concern into concentrated, visible pressure. That translation is still happening. The audiences have broadened. Regulators, investors, rating agencies, and the employees inside companies are all now part of the accountability infrastructure that Earth Day helped build. The question for today's business leaders isn't whether that infrastructure exists. It's whether their organizations are positioned to operate credibly within it. The companies taking this seriously are pulling ahead. A pattern has emerged in the data that directly challenges the assumption that environmental accountability comes at a financial cost. CDP's 2026 Corporate Health Check, produced in collaboration with Oliver Wyman, found that companies scoring at leadership level on environmental performance realized $218 billion in environmental opportunities over the prior 12 months. Those same companies grew their market capitalization at a compound annual rate of about 4% between 2022 and 2025, compared to 1% for companies at other performance levels. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, passed 10,000 companies with validated science-based emissions targets in January 2026, a milestone that followed 40% growth in validated commitments during 2025 alone. That's not a niche practice. It represents a meaningful portion of global market capitalization, making structured, verifiable commitments to emissions reduction. And a Harvard Business Review analysis published in September 2025, drawing on a study of 75 multinational firms, found that only 13% had retreated from sustainability commitments despite the political headwinds of recent years. 85% held steady or accelerated, often quietly, without the press releases. The story of who is actually doing the work looks different from the headline narrative. Accountability is the point, not the obstacle. The companies that have built the most durable environmental records share something in common with what Nelson built in 1970. They didn't separate the question of doing from the question of being held accountable for it. They treated accountability as the mechanism that makes action real, not as the inconvenient audit that follows it. That distinction matters now more than it ever has. Environmental commitments made publicly are increasingly being cross-referenced against third-party data, verified emissions inventories, and regulatory filings. Rating agencies score disclosures against independent sources. Investors are requesting documentation that goes well beyond sustainability report narratives. The distance between what a company says and what it can prove is being measured with increasing precision. The companies that will look back on this period as a turning point are the ones treating that accountability infrastructure as a design requirement, not a compliance burden. Building systems that produce verifiable data, engaging with disclosure platforms proactively, and making sure legal and finance are involved in environmental commitments before they're made. These are the moves that turn Earth Day from an annual communications moment into something with actual organizational weight. What 56 years actually tells us. Nelson once described his goal not as a clean environment in the narrow sense, but as an environment of decency, quality, and mutual respect for all human beings and all other living creatures. That framing was deliberate. He understood that environmental accountability and human accountability were the same project. The companies that have internalized that understanding, the ones where sustainability is woven into governance, capital allocation, and operational decision-making, rather than housed in a communications function, are the ones building something that lasts. Earth Day at 56 isn't just asking for celebration, it's asking for proof. The organizations that can provide it are in a better position than those still treating the day as an occasion for statements. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.